there is one lens in almost every single camera system that's extremely cheap, has great optical performance, is very versatile, and fills up a whole range in focal lengths. And most people either don't know that this lens exists at all, or they just don't pay attention to it. And this is, in my opinion, a secret sauce to every single production. And this lens is the 135. This is the Canon EF mount 135 f2, and Sony definitely has a 135. I believe it's f1.8. So why do I think that this lens is the secret weapon? Well, there are various reasons, so we're going to go through them one by one, and in the very end, we're going to see if this lens can dethrone the 70-200 f2.8. Alright, first, this lens is much smaller than the 70-200 f2.8, and even comparing this lens to, let's say, the RF mount 70-200 f2.8, which is extremely small, like there's almost no comparison. This lens is smaller than a 24-70 f2.8. Like, excuse me? This lens has a 72mm filter diameter, while this has like an 82mm. This is the f2 telephoto lens that is smaller than a 24-70. And this lens is half the price of the 70-200 f2.8, and it almost matches it in every spec. And with being small and being light and being cheap, this lens doesn't draw attention. Like if you put this on a reasonably sized body, nobody will suspect you for having a telephoto lens. Let's say if you go to a concert or something, where if you bring out like this 70-200, they might just go up to you and ask for your permits. If you pull out a 135, nobody is gonna ask you for permits, and you'll have a much better time in actually getting the shots versus like dealing with security and showing them like your media passes or whatever. This lens is just much more discreet. With being light, on the other hand, it's much easier to fly this lens on a gimbal. For example, if you try to balance a 70-200 on a Rode S, you will know how difficult it is. If you want your lens to be compatible on a gimbal, forget about a 70-200. It's almost impossible. And because it's so difficult to balance a 70-200 on a gimbal, it makes this sort of shot more pleasing, because it's very rare to see a telephoto lens on a gimbal flying very smoothly, doing all sorts of camera moves. So with the 135, you actually pull off some sick gimbal moves, and because it's so difficult to do, other people would think that this is a high production quality, while in fact it's just as easy, if not easier, to balance a 135 than a 24-70. Okay, but you're probably thinking, this is a 135, it's a prime, and primes are scary, right? You want zooms, you want flexibilities. That's not really the case. If you really think about it, the reason that I think 135 is at a very special spot instead of the 100 macro is that 135, if you factor in the APS-C crop, 135 is extremely effective. So for shooting video, most camera can do an APS-C crop from full frame, right? When you need to get in closer, you can actually crop to APS-C. You can find this in either the APS-C Super 35 settings on Sony or the movie cropping setting in Canon. So if you do that, you actually punch in 1.5 times, and depending on your camera, you might actually retain full frame or even have higher resolutions because you're super sampling. So what I'm saying is, if you put APS-C crop on this lens, it gives you an effective focal length of that lens without crop. That's insane. It's not even that bad if you factor in the aperture, because when you multiply crop factor, you not only have to multiply that to the focal length, you also have to multiply that to the aperture. So this lens is at f2, and if you multiply that, it gives you an f3 at 200mm, which is still not that bad. It's still better than an f4 70-200. Of course, you'll lose some sharpness because you're cropping down further and further using a smaller and smaller area of your total image circle. But that's okay. If you want the extra reach, you can get the extra reach. And circling back, because this lens is at f2, it can actually match the bokeh quality of the 70-200 f2.8. You're basically trading some of that focal length for aperture. And if you want that crazy bokeh of the 70-200, you can get that with a 135. And lastly, if this lens is at 135, what do I do with the focal length between 70 and 135? Like, that gap is pretty empty, right? Wrong again, because you can also multiply a crop factor of 1.5 to the 24-70, and if you multiply 70 with 1.5, that gives you a 105mm lens, which is just a little bit below the 135 to 200mm that this lens provides you. In practicality's term, if you're a photographer, I'd say it's okay to go with a 70-200, which is also why that I still have this lens around. But if you're just shooting video, I almost never pick up the 70-200 because for video you have gimbal and you want to match the focal length and you want to match the lens aesthetics, it's really not that useful to keep a 70-200 around. In conclusion, 135, this is the secret weapon. You can find this with Canon, you can find this with Sony, especially if you factor in that Sigma also makes the 135, makes it like extremely sharp. It's usually like very cheap, very effective, very small and compact, doesn't draw attention. You can fly this on a gimbal, you can take this into concerts. It takes up less space in a camera bag, it's strange to armless. If you're considering buying it, I don't have an affiliation link, but just go to Amazon and buy it. And if you're tired with their 70-200, you're looking over the RF system for their smaller 70-200, maybe consider the 135. Alright, anyways, if you like this content, please like and subscribe. We have more photography content, filmmaking content on this channel. Also like me and Cathy's lives and what we do in Shanghai and all that stuff. So anyways, bye.